Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jared Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. Hello there. You probably weren't expecting to get another Podcast on the Brink episode in your feed so quickly. But you may recall a couple weeks back, Alex and I did a mailbag episode, and at the end of that episode, we tacked on a little bonus content that was from Ben Ladner and Seth Tao. They are our interns. We have a joint internship between Inside the Hall and the Assembly Call. Ben and Seth are filling those positions this year, doing a great job so far. And so that the first episode that we played you after the mailbag was the first episode of The Matchup, which is a podcast that they're going to be doing this year, previewing Indiana's opponents. And so what we have now for you here, kind of a bonus episode for this week, is their episode of The Matchup. Ben and Seth, and they have a guest on with them. They are going to be talking about Marquette, and they're going to be talking about Arkansas. So even if you listen to this episode after the IU-Marquette game, still listen because they're going to talk about Arkansas if you want to get some insight on the Razorbacks. So I won't come on here and provide an introduction every single time, but I just wanted to, for those of you who might have missed that mailbag episode, just wanted you to know why we were having another episode, who these two new voices are that you're hearing. But they really know their stuff, really smart basketball guys, and so we're really enjoying the work that they've been doing so far in the internship, and we hope that you enjoy this episode and the rest of their work this season on The Matchup. Without further ado, here are Ben and Seth.
Hello and welcome to The Matchup. I'm Ben Ladner, joined by Seth Tao, and of the Marquette Wire, John Steppe. Great to have you with us, John. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So Indiana, obviously, big matchup coming up with Marquette Wednesday night. We're recording this on a Tuesday evening, so by the time this gets out, it will be game day. Really, Indiana's first test of the season after playing Chicago State and Montana State, who didn't really put up much of a fight in the first two games. So the best place to start, I guess, is with Marquette's shooting, because they're a team that shoots a lot of threes. They have Markus Howard, maybe one of the best off-the-dribble three-point shooters in the country. So, John, just to kind of get your perspective, and you are as close to that team as anyone, is that kind of the main thing that Marquette's attack is oriented around, and just how good is Markus Howard?
Well, Markus Howard, he really just showed his talents on display against Bethune-Cookman. 37 points without even that many minutes. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but you saw what he could do in terms of scoring right there. The difference with this team is in past years, they've been very much reliant on his three-point shot, on now gone, graduated senior Andrew Rousey's three-point shot, and Sam Hauser's three-point shot. That was how their offense functioned in past years. The big difference this year is they now have a bit more balance. They have a bit more of a post presence that Steve Wojciechowski really hasn't had really since Henry Ellenson was here. So it's a much more balanced team. Still, even with that more balance, the three-point shot's still really what Marquette's known for.
You mentioned Sam Hauser. He and his brother Joey are two of the more dangerous players on Marquette. What makes those two guys such weapons?
Well, really the interesting thing first with Sam is he started out as a freshman, kind of just as a three-point, you could give it to him in the corner and he'd hit the shot type player. The thing that now he's developed is really the ability to do more with the ball, drive a little bit into the paint. So really, I think as Jay Wright said during one of the Big East conference calls last year, he described Sam Hauser as one of the most underrated players in the country. Just because he, for all of his time, has been overshadowed by Markus Howard, and when Rousey was here, Andrew Rousey. But he's one of those players that if you don't pay attention to, he can do just as much damage. With Joey, it's still a little bit of, kind of figuring out where his game is at. He missed a good chunk of last year with an injury. His high school senior season cut short. So it's a little more of a question mark there. He brings a little more physicality than what Sam Hauser brings. When they were both in high school, the thought was Joey Hauser eventually will be better than Sam. Whether that remains the case, I think everybody was a little surprised by how quickly Sam developed in college. Whether that remains the case after Joey's injury as well is still a bit more up in the air.
And those three guys, Howard and the Hauser brothers, are going to be the names that IU fans mainly recognize. But who are some under-the-radar guys that IU fans should look out for tomorrow night?
I think one interesting one that really hasn't gotten much attention is Theo John, the sophomore center. He's really a guy that has developed his defensive game. At first, he was committing something like 11 or 12 fouls per 40 minutes. So Wojo just couldn't have him on the court. This year, it's still a little bit of an issue, but he's much more disciplined. So he really adds a bit more of a presence to the paint, especially defensively. So I think that's one person there. Another name that hasn't necessarily taken off yet, but has the ability to, is the freshman Brendan Bailey. Not exactly the most conventional freshman, 21 years old. He actually was on a 2-year Mormon mission. So he's been committed to Marquette. He was actually in Markus Howard and Sam Hauser's recruiting class. So he's somebody that not exactly the typical freshman that you'd expect. A guy I think he's listed at 6'9", can hit the 3 too. He hasn't necessarily had to be relied on when you're playing UMBC and Bethune-Cookman. But if Indiana stops Markus Howard, if they stop Sam Hauser, that's somebody that could go off offensively.
Seems like a real Stillman White kind of guy. A guy who played for UNC a couple of years ago, who I think he took his Mormon mission in the middle of his career. Like, he played 2 years, then took 2 years off, then came back. He was, just his career spanned for like almost a decade. Anyway, so obviously Marquette likes to shoot a lot of threes. Over half of their shots this season have been from three. They've got a lot of guys who can knock it down. Markus Howard, obviously, is one. Sam Hauser gets up 6.5 a game. They've got a couple guys who shoot in that 2.5 to 3.5 per game range. But just kind of stylistically, how do they go about generating those looks, and what's kind of the aesthetic quality of their offense that you would use to describe it?
Well, I think the thing that they're trying to do a bit more this year that they haven't necessarily done as much in the past is really using the fast break to get things started. I actually just wrote in this week's newspaper about how Markus Howard is looking to become a better rebounder with the thought of that's going to start the fast break. So really, I think that's something that could be added that hasn't traditionally been in that. It's really been kind of a space the floor type offense through Wojciechowski's first couple years. It was a little different when Henry Ellenson was here, just because when you get the 5th best recruit in the country and he's a power forward, all of a sudden your offense is going to revolve around him.
Right.
But since Markus Howard and Sam Hauser came in, it's been kind of this space the floor, up-tempo offense.
Specifically in this matchup tomorrow night, obviously a bigger matchup, is there anything specific you're looking for from Marquette in this matchup?
Well, I think the interesting thing is this team, kind of like Indiana, is a lot different than past years. They have kind of a different setup, so it's going to be a little bit of a test for both teams because both teams playing two not-so-great opponents so far in terms of how does everything come together with this group. The interesting thing that I'm probably going to be watching the most closely is how this defense does, because they've been statistically one of the worst in, I don't want to say Power 5 because Big East technically isn't the Power 5 conference, but in those top 6 basketball conferences, Marquette's been one of the worst defensive teams. And this year, they're in the top 20 for Ken Palm's adjusted defensive efficiency. So it's been something that they've developed really well, that they've done a lot better. Is this just a fluke against UMBC and Bethune-Cookman? Or is this legitimately a different defense than Wojciechowski's had, since he took over?
Yeah, and that actually leads me to my next question, because their defense has been really, really good this season. They're allowing just 26% from the field from opponents, and obviously, those have come against two opponents who are not quite in the realm of an Indiana or really anyone else that Marquette's going to see in the Big East. But is that defense, I mean, what are they doing that's different maybe, or is it maybe just a product of playing bad opponents?
Well, I think the biggest thing is changing personnel, where they were a little undersized in a lot of matchups last year, where Matt Helt, the senior from Neenah, Wisconsin, was last year starting regularly. Now he's gotten only a couple minutes each game. So there's all of a sudden that many more players that you can go from somebody starting to playing a couple minutes, that really when you have the personnel down low, it makes it easier to have a 5'11", if that guard and Markus Howard running the point. It also helps that they only have one 6-foot or sub 6-foot starter. The past, when you had Rousey and Howard both defending, and they're both below 6 feet, they have Howard listed at 5'11". That might be a little optimistic. When you have those guys, and then you don't have a true big player, because Theo John was still a little too inexperienced at Morrow in his redshirt year, that's where a lot of the issues were coming. So now it's just kind of different personnel, and as a result, much different results.
So obviously Marquette unblemished on the season, perfect record, but if there is a blueprint, I mean, what do you see as kind of the things that opponents will need to do to beat this team?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to stop Markus Howard. When Markus Howard goes off like he did against Bethune-Cookman, it can end games early for opponents. So I think that's really the big thing. Also, Marquette has not exactly been great in terms of holding on to the ball. So if you can get in passing lanes, cause some turnovers, that has been a little bit of a weakness. While they've won easily the first two games, they haven't exactly looked perfect in the process. So there are definitely some things that you can capitalize on. But I mean, it really has to start at stopping Markus Howard, forcing other players to get involved. I mean, outside of Markus Howard, outside of Sam Hauser, you don't have that many proven scorers. So really, if you want to win, you have to stop Markus, then stop Sam. And then at that point, I think you have a pretty good chance. I mean, it depends on kind of what other players do, but it makes it a lot more realistic.
Well, John, we really appreciate you calling in and giving your insight on Marquette here on the matchup.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks a lot, John. We'll talk to you later.
So that was John Steppe from the Marquette Wire. You can keep up with his work on the Marquette Wire website. We'll go into the Indiana perspective a little bit more now for this matchup.
I will say, good to have another student on the show.
The
student guest call in. It's a whole student-run production here.
100%. So obviously still, as we mentioned many times, it's a big matchup. Marquette's now ranked number 24 in the country. Indiana's not ranked. They're second in the list of also receiving votes. So these teams are seen in the national eye pretty similar level. And like he said, these teams stack up pretty similarly as far as where these two programs are at.
I think so, and I think, like we've been saying with Indiana the last few days or so, the same is true for Marquette. This is the first real proving opportunity of the season for both of these teams. They've both played pretty bad opponents, both won big in their first two games of the year, and this is the first time they'll be playing, another high-profile, high-quality opponent. So, Indiana, you would think with maybe the upper hand, given that it's in Assembly Hall, they have the home floor, and obviously the team's looked good so far. But I will be really, really interested to see, what things stylistically and thematically from those first two games are real, what's going to hold up in this game, and what maybe was just a product of playing some inferior competition. And I think that starts with Markus Howard, a really dynamic guard who can score from a lot of different levels of the floor, particularly from three. How does Indiana deal with that? How effective can they be, and what does that look like against the pack line defense? Yeah,
for as much as this is like really Indiana's first test, I mean, Markus Howard is going to be one of the tougher players they face all season long.
Yeah, which is saying something because they're going to face Daniel Gafford, they're going to face Zion Williamson, R.J. Barrett, Cam Reddish. I mean, there's a lot of really, really good players on that schedule. So that's
not even mentioning all the Big Ten,
right?
All the Big Ten guys they'll face.
But Howard is definitely in that conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. stopping Howard is going to be a real challenge. Especially given the news today that Devontae Green is going to be a game time decision tomorrow. If he can't go, I mean, there will be a lot on Rob Phinisey's shoulders tomorrow night if Devontae Green can't go.
And especially with Al Durham kind of banged up, I don't know his status going into the game, but he's been kind of nicked up here and there and hasn't really been able to provide those consistent minutes in the backcourt. So yeah, I mean, if Devontae Green is the only available point guard, maybe we see Johnny Jager out there. Maybe it's Romeo Langford kind of running that point spot. I don't really know who the other option would be if Devontae Green doesn't play. So I would guess that if he's able to get out there, and my guess would be that they'd push him a little bit just because they don't have much guard depth. Whereas if this were a game where you knew Al Durham was healthy, maybe it was a different position or a different opponent that didn't have as dynamic a guard as Markus Howard is, in a different situation, maybe you hold him out. But I would guess that if he's able to give them anything, he'd probably be in that lineup. Yeah,
and in some other cases when you have tougher defensive assignments that in other case against other matchups, it may not. Phinisey's going to get help. The entire team is keying in on Markus Howard. Obviously, he's the top scorer on this team. But the thing is, with other guards that Phinisey may have trouble with, especially early in the season, it's easy to say, oh, maybe they can just kind of stick Romeo on him for a little bit and help him out. But the problem is you can't really do that against this Marquette team because of the size they have around the perimeter. Just Markus Howard's really the only actual guard they start in their starting lineup. They really play with him and 4 forwards. And if you stick Romeo Langford on Markus Howard, then you probably have Rob Phinisey guarding a guy who's a lot taller than him.
Yeah. And also, Zach McRoberts, he had some back problems in that Montana State
game time decision as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you have to kind of rejigger some of those defensive matchups, then that makes Zach McRoberts all the more important on the wing, especially if you have to put a wing on Markus Howard. So, the question to me is going to be when Rob Phinisey isn't in the game. If Devontae Green doesn't play, who is that guy? Who's the defender there? Maybe they just match up his minutes with Markus Howard, say whenever he goes out of the game, Phinisey's also coming out, and just kind of do it 1-for-1 in that sense. But yeah, it'll be a tough matchup and something that I don't think Indiana has really had the opportunity to prepare for, at least not in a game sense. Even last season, I don't think they really faced a player like this with, this type of personnel that they have right now. And then another thing is, you can take away Markus Howard, you can try to, but then, those other guys, how good are they going to be at knocking down catch and shoot threes? And, how good will Markus Howard be at finding those players? He's a pretty good passer, good distributor, really good off the dribble, point of attack kind of facilitator, but he's a shoot first kind of guy. Obviously, he's shooting 11 threes per game through 2 games. And he wants to shoot the ball. And the way Indiana's defense is designed, it kind of plays into guys like Markus Howard. It's kind of geared towards stopping those types of players because you bring that big man all the way out on the hedge on the pick and roll. You prevent ball penetration. You don't let guys just dribble in to pull up threes. So in some ways, Indiana is pretty well equipped schematically to stop Markus Howard and Marquette. But the downside of that is that, when you get dribble penetration, the help defenders, and really even if you're one pass away, are sagging so far off of their guys relative to conventional man-to-man defense that those catch and shoot threes are, you're more vulnerable to that type of play. So that'll be a really interesting balance. How much do you give up to Markus Howard versus how much do you let the other guys shoot? And if the role players are hot, do you change up some philosophies there? Do you change some matchups? Do you defend Howard differently? What's the balance between letting him eat and taking away the other guys and ensuring that no one player is able to get off and Marquette isn't able to beat you with multiple different people?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the hedge on the pick and roll because at the press conference today, Evan Fitzner kind of said they may have to change up the way they kind of play the pick and roll, the way they defend screens, just because not only because of Markus Howard, but because of guys like the Hauser brothers that, if you hedge hard on a pick and roll, that you risk leaving one of the Hauser brothers open for 3.
Right.
And, those guys are dangerous from 3.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the answer to that is probably just to play kind of a more conventional drop coverage where the guard, you got to stay attached to Markus Howard's hip as best you can, not let him dribble into that pull-up three, and just fight over the screen and try to stay attached to his hip while the big man comes up to the level of the screen, but kind of keeps that arm's distance from the screener. So like you mentioned, they've got some bigs who can shoot the ball. So if they step out, you can still recover to those guys. I mean, remember last year, teams just dice Indiana up on the pick and pop. Like if an opponent had a big guy that could shoot, he was going to get 5 or 6 open looks per game just because their defense wasn't really equipped to handle that. And if it wasn't the popping big shooting, it was the guy one pass away in the corner when the help defense rotated up. So there were certainly some vulnerabilities there on defense to that sort of offense. And Marquette is the type of team that plays that sort of offense. So I think those are, good insights from Fitzner as far as just what to expect. And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw multiple different types of coverage from Indiana in this game, just trying things to see what works until they settle on something that does, or until maybe they don't find anything that does work and they get, they just can't find a way to stop Marquette, which is plausible when you have a guy like Markus Howard. I mean, there's only so much you can really do to contain him.
Right. I mean, you throw on the tape of Markus Howard from his first 2 games, and it's clear that it's just how hard it is to stop him, because not only can he pull up and shoot from pretty much any spot around the arc, when you look at some of these highlights from those first 2 games, I mean, he's hitting some step back threes. Yeah. He's hitting threes with guys in his face. It's not like these guys, it's not like I'm sure Bethune Cookman and UMBC are maybe not going to be as well prepared defensively as Indiana.
Hey, you're talking about NCAA tournament legend UMBC.
Yes,
Let's put some respect on that name.
Yes. But, while Indiana's probably going to be more well equipped defensively than those 2 teams are, just in terms of length and everything, I mean, Howard's just hitting threes with guys in his face. And when you have a player that can do that, I mean, what are you going to do?
I don't know. At the same time, though, to me, if a guy's hitting those types of shots, you lose. You say, okay, nice shot. Like, what else? What? Like you said, what can you do? So to me, it's almost better if a guy's hitting those types of shots, just keep playing the best you can, keep trying to execute as well as you can, and don't overreact and send multiple bodies unless the guy is just absolutely feeling it and you have to get the ball out of his hands. But, in some ways, a guy heating up like that, it opens up a lot for other players, because when you send extra attention his way, you change up your defensive scheme to put 2 on the ball, then sometimes other guys can be open. And it's, the Hauser brothers or some other role players that Marquette has, it's them hitting those shots and they're getting wide open shots as opposed to Markus Howard hitting contested shots over you, if that makes sense. So in some ways, you'd rather live with a guy hitting contested shots than giving up open shots to lesser shooters, but it just depends. It's a situational thing. It depends on how hot a guy is, how cold the rest of the team is, or vice versa. So one thing I found interesting was that, John talked about the turnovers for Marquette, how they've kind of struggled to hold on to the ball. And one thing that Indiana's done really well this season and wants to continue to do is force turnovers, get out in transition and score off of turnovers and let their defense kind of lead into their offense. I think that could be something that, if there's one kind of identifiable thing that Indiana can do to win this game, that might be it.
Yeah, Marquette has turned it over 16. They had 11 turnovers against UMBC and they had 22 against Bethune Cookman. Yeah. So, if they're going to turn it over, take the average, and you're at what, like 16? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of that
Quick
is,
math.
He mentioned playing that up-tempo style, and, a lot of threes, a lot of getting up and down is going to lead itself to some turnovers just because there's more possessions and you're playing kind of a more aggressive style, but still 22 turnovers, regardless of the pace, regardless of the style, is a lot of turnovers.
And if Markus Howard's really hitting all the shots, that may be the way Indiana's able to stay in the game, is if they're able to get quick scores off of turnovers. That's really the best counter they'll have to Markus Howard, especially given that Indiana is not the most efficient team when it comes to shooting the three themselves.
Right. Watching Markus Howard just, briefly before we taped this, is the guy he kind of reminds me of is Damian Lillard. Like every time I watched one of his highlights or a possession where coming off the pick and roll, getting to the basket, I kept seeing shades of Dame Lillard, like with his handle, the way he goes between his legs, kind of does that hesitation dribble, and then even his shooting form is fairly similar. Also a kind of a smaller guard who's able to hit deep shots. So,
yeah, and getting back to some of the Indiana injuries and such, I mean, Zach McRoberts, if he's not able to go, that's a huge loss for Indiana. I mean, they've been banged up till now, and it's mainly just been kind of depth guys and come off the bench type of guys, Devontae Green, Al Durham, Race Thompson, Jerome Hunter. But Zach McRoberts is a big player on this team, and it's conceivable that he would draw the Sam Hauser matchup if he's able to go. So that would be a big loss for Indiana if he can't go.
Yeah, I totally agree. One other note that I would make, just to, an expectation, I think Indiana will try to slow this game down. Unless they're getting out in transition and scoring directly off of turnovers, I wouldn't expect them to really push the pace in the same way that Marquette will. They like to get up a lot of shots, move the ball up and down, and kind of play at a faster tempo. Indiana, defensively, they certainly want to slow the game down. They want to make teams work for an entire shot clock. And then offensively, one thing that I really liked about their performance against Montana State was the patience that they showed on offense. And I don't think this is a team that's just going to take the first available shot and jack up a bunch of threes. Archie Miller said multiple times that this isn't a team that aspires to shoot a lot of threes, and they want to be more methodical, work the ball into the lane, around the basket, get to the free throw line, that kind of thing. So I would expect, the pace could be a really good indicator of who wins this game. If it's a high tempo, fast paced game, that might favor Marquette because they're getting more shots up. They're getting, high percentage shooters, high percentage looks. If it's a slower kind of drag out kind of fight, that might favor Indiana because it means that they're making Marquette work on offense, and also they're making that defense move when Indiana has the ball.
Yeah, and one of the other guys that John mentioned when I asked him about some of the under the radar guys, Theo John, their big man, and he could cause some problems inside for Indiana. He's 6'9", 240. And he can really get after it on the offensive glass. Yeah. I mean, I was watching those the highlights from the UMBC game for Marquette. John came off the bench in that game, but had a double-double off the bench, and he had 5 offensive rebounds in that game. And I mean, that's a pretty big impact off the bench.
Yeah, and Indiana's rebounded the ball pretty well in their 2 games, but with that smaller front court that they play with Morgan and Smith, you wonder if rebounding maybe it could be a weak point relative to the competition this season. So, yes, certainly if Marquette feels like they can gain, an advantage on the boards and try to beat Indiana on the offensive glass, that might be something that they try to exploit, and they just send John to the glass and all their other big guys and try to gobble up as many offensive rebounds as they can. I would expect Indiana will see that coming and try to place a greater emphasis on defensive rebounding. I don't think Indiana's going to attack the offensive boards very aggressively. That's just not really the way I see them playing this season. But yeah, certainly Marquette could be a team that sees that as maybe an exploitable advantage.
I want to get to the Arkansas matchup as well.
Let's do it.
Indiana's going to play Arkansas on Sunday. That's their next matchup right after Marquette, and that's a big game too. Although Arkansas is not ranked at like Marquette is. That's obviously just the first road game they're going to play. That's significant in its own right, and Arkansas is not an easy place to play from what everyone has been saying about Arkansas. They're number 53 in KenPom right now. They're 1-1. They dropped a game to Texas in overtime. Texas hit a shot with like 1 second left to send it to overtime, and then prevailed in overtime. But when you look at Arkansas, you got to start with Daniel Gafford, one of the top centers in college basketball. He had a 20-point, 12-rebound game in that game against Texas, and he can really just dominate you.
He can. And again, like I mentioned in our first kind of broad scope episode of this podcast, he's a guy that a lot of people had in their lottery first round range in last year's NBA draft, decided to come back to school, could very well be a lottery pick this year. So IU's going to face some talented individual players here in the early going. And Gafford, 16 points, 8 rebounds on the season, shoots a really, really high percentage, 61% from the floor. Not a guy who's going to step out and take many threes. In fact, he hasn't taken any this season, but he's such a threat in the pick and roll as a lob man, where he has this vertical gravity. When we talk about spacing and shooters having gravity, I think it works the same way for elite rollmen, where when they're diving to the basket, that weak side corner defender has to come in and tag the roll man. Otherwise, it's going to be a lob dunk. And there aren't many of those guys in college basketball who are just going to rise up over people and throw down lobs. But Gafford is one of them, and he plays with such high energy. He's got a great motor, works really hard. He's now a sophomore, so he's got kind of some more muscle on his frame and is just a force to be reckoned with inside. So I think the choice for IU is going to be take away Gafford and his lobs, or, risk a quick skip pass to the opposite corner for a weak side three. And neither of those options are great, but that's the kind of predicament that a talent like Daniel Gafford puts you in, a guy who's athletic and can get up off the ground. It kind of bends the way that you have to play defense against that team. Yeah, and going on that on the preseason podcast we recorded, we kind of theorized that this could be a De'Ron Davis kind of game, but as we've seen so far, and there's nothing that's been said to indicate otherwise, Davis is probably still not going to start that game, even with the matchup they're facing. No, and honestly,
he's just not there yet physically.
And I don't know that he'd be a great matchup with Daniel Gafford anyway. I think Juwan Morgan is probably a better fit there, just because, like I mentioned, the athleticism and the vertical element to Gafford's game. I just don't think Davis is well suited to handle that. So I actually think that could be one of De'Ron Davis's lower minute games of the season, just because the athleticism required to keep up with Daniel Gafford, De'Ron Davis just doesn't have, even when he's healthy. He's just not really that kind of vertical athlete. Strong guy, good rebounder, good interior defender, but against those really elite athletes, it's just, I think Morgan or Justin Smith would be a better, maybe even a Jake Forrester. I don't know that he's quite there yet. I'd be surprised if he played much in that game. But I think that's the kind of player that you need to stick on Gafford, someone who can hang with him athletically.
Yeah. And it's not just Gafford with Arkansas. The thing is, they don't have that much depth in their two games. No bench player played more than 20 minutes, and only 3 between the two games have played more than 15 minutes. By comparison, IU's had 3 bench players exceed 20 minutes and 6 play 15 minutes. Yeah. So, they're not playing with much depth. They rely heavily on their starters, but their starters have been pretty effective. The other name that I'll throw out there is a guard, Isaiah Joe, a true freshman, 6'5", 167. He put up 17 in that game against Texas and 14 against UC Davis. He can shoot the threes. He was 5 of 8 from 3 against Texas, and the Romeo Langford versus Isaiah Joe matchup could surprisingly be interesting.
Yeah, and shooting 54% from 3 on the season. Another guy, Mason Jones, who 46% from 3. Those are kind of the two guys that I think really benefit from Gafford's gravity and the guys who are really going to bomb away. This isn't like Marquette, where there's one guy who takes a ton of threes and then the rest of the team is kind of in those lower ranges. And it's not a team that takes as many threes as Marquette, period. But I think Jones and Joe are the two guys that are really going to launch and the guys that you really have to stick tight to. I think probably Zach McRoberts and Romeo Langford get the assignments there.
Assuming McRoberts goes.
But that'll be, a little less than a week from now. So we'll see how healthy they are.
It seems like it's a lingering thing for McRoberts, so you really just never know.
Yeah, especially with the back too. I don't think you want to push that.
Yeah.
But
and then the other thing with Arkansas, you will have to watch out for this if you're Indiana, is their press defense. Mm-hmm. That especially at home for Arkansas, that causes opponents some problems, and it's a look that IU hasn't seen yet, and I'm interested to see how they handle it.
Yeah, and particularly Rob Finney. I mean, Markus Howard is going to be a great test for him defensively, but then offensively, how does he handle that press? Because obviously it's the point guard that's mostly tasked with getting the ball across half court against a press defense. So it'll be ball movement. I think Romeo Langford will probably play a big role in helping break that as well. Juwan Morgan, with his ball handling versatility for a big man, could be instrumental there. So it'll really, breaking a press, it's one of those things where once you kind of get the solution, once you kind of figure it out, it's pretty easy to break a press when you kind of figure out, okay, inbound it, then make this pass to this spot, and then you're off. And that's kind of all there is to it. But well-designed presses, they pressure you so much that those decisions are A, not always apparent, and B, not always available because there's just so much pressure that you can't make that pass that you need to. So I'll be interested, if Indiana figures it out kind of quickly and is able to find a solution to how to break that press early, maybe even before the game. They're going to do a ton of scouting, obviously come prepared with some kind of game plan. How quickly do they figure that out? And then, because really a press, not only is it designed to force turnovers, which Arkansas does, and they're really good at it, and Louisville too is a good example of
West
that.
Virginia.
Yeah, these really high pressure pressing teams, they want to take the ball away, but also one of the benefits of running a press is that the offense has like 15, 20 seconds to get into its sets and run its possession rather than 25 or 30. So you're just reducing the amount of time that a team has to run its offense. Whereas, I think a lot of people kind of get caught up on the idea of forcing turnovers, and a press is only successful if it forces turnovers. But really, the main benefit that you get is that you just reduce the amount of time that an opponent has to run its offense.
Right. And I watched some video on the way Arkansas presses just to kind of see what they do. They mix up the looks they give you in the press. It's not a necessarily consistent set. Sometimes they'll bring 3 back on the press. Sometimes it's 4. But either way, really, it seems like what they try to do most of the time is they try to force the recipient of the inbound pass, assuming it's the point guard. They try to force the point guard towards the corner and then trap them there. They'll stick 2 guys on them there, and they also will try to jump in front of passing lanes. They use some of their size to try to cut off some aerial passes, and they try to jump in front of passing lanes to create some turnovers there. But that's really what the looks that Arkansas tries to give you. They try to trap the ball handler in the corner. So yeah, it's going to be a big test for Rob Finney if he's going to end up trapped in the corner early in that game. What's he going to do? It helps to have a tall guard like Romeo Langford, where a smaller shooting guard, like if it was Devontae Green there, you may have some trouble trying to see Devontae Green because over the guys, but Romeo Langford may be tall enough to where you can still see him.
And it also helps
when you're trapped.
And it also helps if Romeo has the ball and he's able to see over the defenders and find other guys. So I wouldn't be surprised too. A lot of teams run what's called a secondary press, where they look for that trap, a second trap if they don't get the first one, right when the offense crosses half court, because you can't go back. And they kind of use the half court line and the sideline as well as the 2 defenders to box a guy into a corner. So you'll see that a lot too. But yeah, it's usually that kind of, they call it the coffin corner, around the short corner, in the behind the 3-point line. And then again, once you cross half court, those are kind of the 2 zones that defense look to trap you in. And you go into the game, you're thinking, okay, like this, I know what they want to do. I know where they want to trap me. I just won't go there. And then you get the ball, and then you go there. That's what it's designed to do. So it kind of, with the well-designed presses, they make an offense go where they know they're not supposed to go, but they really have no other choice. And so it can be really enticing just to dribble the ball to the corner because that's where it's open. But you need to kind of break that habit. And the best thing to do really is just pass the ball as soon as you can and kind of get the defense moving. Once you see the 2 guys commit to you, get rid of it if you can. And then you've got that momentary 4-on-3 and you can push the ball ahead. And then if another trap comes, you just do it again. You find another open guy and you kind of keep it moving rather than allowing the defense to come to you.
Yeah. So Finney will definitely be a key in breaking the press. That'll be a good test of his maturity. His basketball IQ has been on display throughout the first 2 games, but between the Markus Howard test he's going to have and this press and breaking the press of Arkansas, we're really going to see just how high his basketball IQ is.
Was he at availability today?
No, he was not.
I would have been interested to hear his kind of reaction to that, just like what he's thinking going into these 2 games. But yeah.
Yeah. And the other idea that I kind of had is for Indiana, I feel like they could set up some quick scores by kind of leaving Justin Smith on beyond half court on those presses. They may be able to get some long, deep passes over Arkansas, and Justin Smith in a one-on-one with a one-on-one drive to the rack. I mean, look out.
Or a 2-on-1, ideally. Right. I mean, that's one of the advantages if you can break a press, is that I mentioned you can get the 4-on-3, but then that turns to 3-on-2 and then maybe 2-on-1, and then it's Lob City to Justin Smith or Romeo Langford or whoever. So one other pitfall that I might be concerned about if I'm Indiana is that presses can speed a team up. And for a team like IU that doesn't really want to play fast, they can get baited into taking a lot of quick shots, a lot of quick jump shots because they're left open. But that's not really the style that Indiana wants to play. And for a lot of teams, that would be kind of a good position to be in. You get a lot of good open shots. But for a team that doesn't really aspire to play that way, that can be kind of it's almost a trap game where you get these open shots, and so you feel like you have to keep taking them, but they're quick shots. They're not necessarily good shots, and you kind of get sped up and you're not really playing your own game. So that would be one thing that I'd look for as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And beyond the press, the other thing I noticed when I was looking at Arkansas and how they've looked to start the season, kind of similar to IU, they're struggling at the free throw line too. They're shooting just 62% at the free throw line to start the year, and the free throw line battle is one IU needs to win. That free throw line battle at Arkansas. Arkansas is not shooting the free throw very well. Neither is IU, but especially on the road, if IU can win the battle at the free throw line, that bodes big.
It does, and hopefully we have a good officiating crew that doesn't call too many fouls. I know college referees are they have a propensity to whistle unnecessary fouls, so hopefully we get a good crew that's a little light on the whistle and lets these guys play and doesn't show us a bunch of missed free throws all game.
Yeah, no doubt. But
one other point real quick, Mark, Arkansas shoots the three really well, 38% as a team. And that's another team where I'll be interested to see what they can get out of ball screens and if Indiana has to change their defense as a result.
Yeah. And then offensively, we were talking about the press break, but who do you think who on IU do you think would be the key offensively in this game?
I think Juwan Morgan could be important because if you get Daniel Gafford in foul trouble, that changes Arkansas significantly. Yeah. And Juwan Morgan's shown an ability to get opposing bigs into foul trouble, get to the line. I know I just said I don't want the refs to call a bunch of fouls, but if they're earned, if they're warranted, then sure, blow your whistle. But yeah, that could be one. Obviously Romeo Langford's going to be an X factor every game. I think Finney breaking that press, being able to show poise at the point guard position as a freshman against a fast, experienced defense is going to be something to watch for. So really kind of the same usual suspects. Maybe Deron Davis is a factor. Another guy who could maybe get Daniel Gafford into foul trouble. So I think those are kind of the areas.
If he doesn't get into foul trouble himself,
right? Sure. Which is another reason why I don't think you want him on Daniel Gafford because he'll foul out like that. But yeah, I think those are that's going to be the answer for pretty much every game. If you ask me the X factors in the Duke game, I'd probably say the same guys. So yeah, and that's kind of going to be the theme all season long. Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see how Archie Miller decides to attack the press. That's not a look they're going to see I don't think they play very many teams this season that run a press. So it's not something that it's not likely to be something that we're going to come back to very much, if at all, this season.
Yeah. And part of it could be forcing turnovers, getting out in transition, getting easy buckets. A team can't run a press if it doesn't have a chance to set up and get itself ready. So if you are able to force turnovers in the half court and just get the ball back on offense before a defense can press you, then that's that many fewer possessions that they have the opportunity to run that press. So, and another thing too, getting the ball out of the basket early, inbounding it quickly. If you kind of linger, let the ball bounce a couple times, then pick it up and then kind of, mosey over to the side, to the baseline to inbound it, that's more time that a defense has to set up its press. And then you're basically throwing it into a death trap. So,
yeah. And I think the other key for this game, you kind of mentioned the fouls, but I think that's a big key in this game for Indiana is trying to get Arkansas's guys in foul trouble just because of the lack of depth they have.
Right.
Because it doesn't seem like they have guys on their bench that they really trust to step in and take over a game yet. So if one of their starters gets into foul trouble, they are in big trouble unless one of their bench guys just kind of unexpectedly steps up.
Yeah, especially in the front court. They just don't have much depth in the front court. And that's one of the reasons, maybe you bring Deron Davis in when Daniel Gafford's off the floor because Arkansas doesn't have much size beyond Gafford. And so maybe that's a part of the game where you can exploit your advantage down low, be active on the glass, run through the post, and get easy buckets in the paint.
Yeah. So, you have any other points about Arkansas?
That's all
Marquette,
I got.
For that matter?
It'll be, I will not be at either game, unfortunately. You will be at Marquette.
I'll be at Marquette, not Arkansas.
We'll both be watching Arkansas, and and we'll have Duke after that. We'll figure out a way to record some kind of Duke preview, even if we won't be able to do it in person because that, of course, will be it'll be after Thanksgiving, but we won't be able to convene before then. So we'll figure out a way to do that, and for all these, we're about to have some big games coming up, so we'll be able to kind of do this more regularly, look ahead to some of the key matchups, and we'll be doing that all season long. So until next time, we'll talk to you all later.
If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.